Hello, welcome to Snapshot Analysis. My name is Minna Jaffery-Lindemulder, and I'm the content manager here at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy. Today, I'm joined by my colleague Eugene Chausovsky to speak about the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. Eugene, as Russia's conflict in Ukraine drags on, what could a tentative ceasefire or peace agreement look like?
Yeah, thanks, Minna. So right now, the Ukrainian and Russian sides are engaged in some pretty serious negotiations and have been for the last couple of weeks. And we've seen some indications that those could be progressing, although there's still a lot of constraints to a major agreement as well. But from basically what the two sides have laid out is for the Ukrainian side, it's imperative that there's a ceasefire that goes into place and that Russia withdraws its forces at the very least to the pre-February 24th positions that Russia was in. So whether that includes Crimea and eastern Ukraine remains to be seen, but certainly all of the elements that they've gained, the territorial gains that they've made, that's a key sticking point for the Ukrainian side. And really for the Russian side, Moscow has made clear it's essentially about Ukraine's neutrality. So that includes renouncing ambitions to join NATO, but also saying that they wouldn't host any foreign military bases. But it seems like Moscow has held open the possibility that there could be some form of security guarantees or protection from Ukraine's allies, such as the US and the UK. So there's some unclear elements right now as far as the negotiations as well, including what form this protection would take, and then the status of the territories that I mentioned pre-conflict back to 2014 in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine. So we have to see whether this is really a genuine effort to make a peace agreement, especially from Russia, or whether it's Moscow biding its time in order to regroup its forces and potentially go even further. And really, we have to keep in mind that both sides have to be able to sell any kind of agreement that they strike to their respective audiences. So whether that's Ukraine or Russia, there's only so far that both domestic audiences would allow them to strike in a peace agreement.
Eugene, how likely is it that a ceasefire would hold? Based on what we've seen of the humanitarian corridors that have been established in the last couple of weeks, it seems as though Russia is not willing to stop its attacks. So, in what situation would a ceasefire be a reasonable factor?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it's worth noting here that the ceasefire agreements that have been reached so far have not held, but those have largely been limited to humanitarian purposes. And so Russia never indicated that it would be stopping its military operations completely. So in the event of a much more comprehensive deal, which is what we're really talking about here, this would entail a lot more. And I think it's really important that the U.S., as a major backer of the Ukrainian side, has indicated that it would need a lasting withdrawal of Russian forces and some kind of guarantees that they wouldn't just go back in, whether that's in the near future or in a matter of months or years. So that will really be the key component of a more comprehensive agreement in order to actually end the military stage of this conflict.
And can you talk to me about the risks to Ukraine beyond just the military and territorial threats coming from Russia?
That's a very good question. So obviously the most immediate threat to Ukraine comes in the form of the Russian military invasion and occupation. And even as they're engaged in negotiations, as we've discussed, there's no guarantee that those are going to actually lead to a breakthrough deal anytime soon. So number one threat and priority for Ukraine is obviously the Russian military front. But having said that, there are some other threats within Ukraine as well, especially what we saw happen in the initial stage of the conflict with Ukraine getting caught off guard somewhat and the military forces being mobilized, but also the government and security forces handing out a lot of weaponry basically to any citizens that would want them. And currently there's a lot of people being prepared for an insurgency, if you will, if Russia does decide to go into the major cities. So that is a good defensive position for Ukraine, but it also risks internal elements, whether that be criminal elements or far-right ultra-nationalist elements, which Russia has basically raised that and has overblown that threat when it talks about denazification, because that's clearly not the extent to which the Ukrainian government is run. But there are those fringe elements that the Ukrainian state does need to be worried about, perhaps not in the immediate stage of the conflict, but in later stages where those could end up being problems for any Ukrainian state moving forward.
And let's talk lastly about the information war. How do we interpret this lack of reliable information coming from both Ukraine and Russia? And how do we think that shapes policymakers' decisions, especially regarding these negotiations?
Yeah, so the war, as much as it's been playing out on the battlefield, this is an information war as well. And so we've seen, obviously, in terms of Russian propaganda, how Russia is framing the war as a special military operation and really cutting off information channels, shutting down social networks like Facebook and Twitter for its domestic audience. But it's important to keep in mind that the level of information flow coming from the Ukrainian side is limited as well. Now, there are some operational elements to this because Ukraine doesn't want to have all of the information in terms of its losses and in terms of its battle operations available to the public and getting into Russian hands. But there's some elements that are playing up the extent to which the Ukrainian side is victorious and the losses that Russia is taking. The reality is somewhere in between, where it's not a complete Russian victory as Moscow would like to paint it, and it's not just a complete debacle for Russia either, as the Ukrainian side is painting it. So there's some political purposes here, but there's also a lot of misinformation and disinformation that makes getting a very accurate read of the conflict space very difficult.
And how does that affect the leaders of these countries? How does this information war affect the strategic moves that Zelensky and Putin are planning on making?
Well, for Putin, this is about essentially maintaining the operations and ensuring that there is no domestic pushback, significant domestic pushback to what he's trying to do. For Zelensky, it's very important in order to get the support of the West. So we've seen him make his speeches to the US Congress yesterday, to the German Bundestag today. Information is very, very important in order to rally the support that Zelensky and Ukraine badly needs, which it is receiving to a certain extent in terms of weaponry and financial support, but not in terms of direct NATO participation or denying airspace. So this is, as I said, a very key element that's playing into the strategy of both Putin and Zelensky.
Thank you so much for that insight, Eugene. This has been Snapshot Analysis from the New Lines Institute. Please stay tuned for further coverage of Ukraine, Russia, and other issues around the world. Thank you.